Okay, everyone. Here we are, back. Second lesson of week 4. I am realizing that I'm not gonna have enough time to talk about everything that we need to talk about in class, and there's a lot of reasons for that. We had an extra week off this semester, so a lot of things happening, obviously. But what I'm thinking I'm gonna do is we're going. I'm going to add. I'm going to add lectures even after the semester is done. I feel like some of you have engaged with the channel, have engaged with the lectures that I have posted. So I think that's important. So I think that if you're enjoying, if you're learning, I think it's important to keep posting these videos. So look them up after the end of the semester. You have your guidelines for your final paper. Still am waiting to hear from some of you, but I wanted to let you know that we are going to continue with this adventure. I call it adventure. But the idea is that to keep uploading content into this channel, so it's not only for your class. Obviously, the long 1 hour or so lectures, videos, yeah, those are only for our class, for the UIC 263 class, but we're gonna add other videos throughout the summer and even throughout the year. So any of the topics that may be in your syllabus that we didn't talk about, I will come back to them at some point or another. But anyway, so I want to continue to talk about the Casta system, especially in relation to the way that it managed Native Americans and the way that it managed people of Africa in the 17th, 18th century. Because it's complicated. It's not so black and white. No pun intended. But we ended with this image of Miguel Cabrera. I show you a couple of my favorite memes throughout the years because my students are brilliant and they have made some amazing memes in relation to this image. We talked about clothing, the importance of clothing, how clothing is the main signifier of class, of race when it comes to the colonial period. So we talked a lot about different things. And I wanted to continue with the discussion of natives because there was a belief that because of natives had not been mixed, even though there's different groups. But the Spanish had this homogenizing idea that all Native Americans were the same regardless of the region and area of the Americas, that because they had not been mixed, they were considered pure race. And that's what makes this is the point that makes all of this discussion very complicated because purity of blood was not, as I mentioned before, reserved to the Spanish, to the Iberians. Instead, they also believed that indigenous people had purity of blood, but careful. Still, if you were to mix with somebody of indigenous blood, you were still considered a contaminado. You will still consider a contaminated blood caste, and that had consequences. And basically in the rights that you had, but also careful, ojo, it depended on a lot of things. So, for instance, think about the Tlaxcalteca, the group of peoples that aid Hernan Cortes in the battle against the Aztecs in the beginning during the invasion of Tenochtitlan. Because they helped Cortes win that war, they gained special privileges throughout the colonial period. And that's something that, let's say, Los Tarahumaras of Chihuahua did not have, or the Apaches of what today is the Southwest. They didn't have those privileges. Instead, they were considered almost like a lower caste. They were not Indios, they were Indios Barbaros. And we'll talk about that today as well. So, yes, there's a sense of their purity of blood. No, they're not privileged like the Spanish, simply for because ideas of civilization. If you were converted into Christianity, sometimes there was the anxiety that you could go back to your old practices. So it depended on a lot of different things. So it's not just simply to be native or not. What we do know is that natives, as we mentioned in a couple of videos ago, they were not judged. The punitive practices against them were not administered by the Inquisition. Instead, they were administered by the Provisory of Natives. So it's confusing as hell, you know. But it is important to keep those things in mind, because when you look at those paintings, I don't want you to just see the seemingly simplicity that it's portrayed in the compositions of the triangular composition of the Catholic composition of mother, father, and child. Instead, you have to think of these layers, and to top it all up, castas, your race, your privileges, it was all in paperwork. Everything was managed in paperwork. So when we talk about purity of blood, we're talking about trials. We're talking about trials where you're supposed to prove that you were indeed pure of blood, either or Catholic or Indigenous. So again, it's very complicated, but again, to come back to the formal elements or the iconography of the paintings, it's about clothing. The clothing signified this, the clothing signified your status. So you notice that there's layers of textiles, for example, that the Indigenous woman right here in this painting has. So it almost gives you this perspective, these people were important. And you have the combination of Indigenous blood, perhaps pure Indigenous blood, and pure Spanish blood gets a mestizo. And that's why using that terminology, even in the 20th century, it's so problematic, because the idea is that you come from two pure blood, whatever the fuck that means, right? You come from two pure blooded beings, two pure blooded groups. All of that is an illusion. But as much of an illusion as it was, as much as a myth and unreal as it was, it had truth consequences on the rights of peoples. So keep also that in mind. And again, Indigenous people could acquire land, tribute, and even rulership if they had ties with all conquistadores. That's why the example of the Tlaxcalteca is so important to mention, because they have special rights because of their allyship with the conquistadores that other peoples did not have. And again, this is something that is reflected in a lot of the compositions. Sometimes my slides are really good. And believe it or not, the first time that I uploaded the slides into my PowerPoints must have been 10 years or so ago, a little bit before when I started teaching. And here we are in 2021, and there's still not a lot of available. Pero if you want to talk about Raphael and Michelangelo, that shit is pristine. So it is a struggle when you teach some of these things. In political terms, the native people's status as free vassals essentially meant that they were in a kind of contractual relationship with the Spanish crown. In return for a series of rights and privileges, namely recognition of communal organization, internal hierarchies, and access to land, the Indians were to remain loyal to their new monarchs and the Catholic faith. The crown essentially suppressed the rise of a strong colonial aristocracy by transferring control of native laborers to royal officials, and more broadly, by making Indigenous peoples almost quasi-citizen subjects to Spanish rule, but also entitled to certain protection rights and privileges. And all of this information, it's gathered from the book that I told you about, Maria Elena Martinez. And again, it was case to case, and we're going to see the 17th Casta, which was the Los Indios Chichimecas or Los Indios Barbaros, which is its own thing, and they didn't have these kinds of privileges. So here we have Juan Rodriguez Juarez, again, one of the most important artists of the 18th century. So these important artists were commissioned some of this Casta series, and they're serious because every time you see one Casta group, most likely you will see another 15. It was a total of 16 castas that were painted. But as I mentioned before, there were many of those. And Juan Rodriguez Juarez, just like the other artists, continues the simplicity, the inverted triangular of the composition. And again, it's all about the mestizo child that you see right here. Look at the French coat, the French fashion that remains popular throughout the 18th and even part of the 19th century. He is wearing a lot of makeup. The ridiculous white powder wigs that I told you about. And then you have a very elegantly dressed native with different types of textiles. Again, the pearls, very fancy. So all of those give you the impression that this is a very affluent mestizo family. So here we have a series of paintings by Juan Patricio Morlete Ruiz, another important artist. We know that Juan Patricio Morlete Ruiz was an influential member of a painting academy, sort of like an official painting academy that was established in Mexico in the mid 18th century. The official art academy was established later in the 1780s, if I'm not mistaken. And so he was very attuned to the ideas of pictorial innovation. So it wasn't just about the simple family unit of mother and child, or mother, father, and child. Instead, we have beautifully elaborated landscapes. And again, we have to be careful because the way that the landscape function, the Flemish style landscape, the way they function in the 17th century New Spain, it functions differently in Peru, it functions differently in these types of compositions. Instead, what we see is that we have almost like this idea of this family that are part of a land of plentifulness, a land that is full of resources. So we have much more complicated landscapes. We don't have those tipo Echave de los Azules landscapes that we saw before. Instead, we have these beautiful backgrounds. In the foreground, on the bottom right of the composition, you have the still lifes. And that's what's interesting about colonial art, that we don't have a lot of examples of pure still lifes. In New Spain, for instance, we don't have a lot of examples of pure landscapes. Per se, I think Juan Patricio Morlete Ruiz worked on a series. Also in the Los Angeles County Museum, like this painting that you see right here. But you don't have them separate, but they are part of this much more complicated compositions. Again, you have from Spaniard and from Morisco. You're going to get from Morisca, you're going to Spaniard and Morisco, you get albino again. And when we think of albino peoples, there was an understanding that they came from African ancestry. So there's that understanding, but it still is fair skin. So that also came with its privileges. As mentioned by Alona Katsu, we have that Morlete Ruiz, quote, Morlete Ruiz situates the mixed couples in elaborate landscape settings and pays careful attention to the figure's clothing and attributes. For example, some Spanish men hold a sword, a privilege that in colonial legislation was only reserved for this group. Oh, and I wanted to show you this close up. So that's where this text belonged to this slide. Again, for example, some Spanish men hold a sword, a privilege that in a colonial legislation was only reserved for this group, while some women sport a manga, a cape that resembled an inverted skirt fit from the head, worn exclusively by women of African descent. It was adapted from a similar garment worn by Moorish women in Spain. So once again, we have very complicated textiles, very complicated clothing that not only reflects the global nature of the colonies, of the Spanish colonies in the Americas, but also it's about your casta. It's a signifier for your race. We have here now Spanish mixes with albino, and the result is jump backwards. That's literally the translation, and we talked about this in the last class. Return backwards. Same formula. Beautiful, complicated, almost sublime type of landscapes we see right here in the background, but still the focus is on the simple approach to the family unit. And then of course it's a world of plentifulness. So you get not only the elaborated landscapes, but you also get the still lifes on the bottom right of the composition. So this again, given this idea that he was part of the academy, inventiveness is important. So it's a different type of approach to the casta painting. Here we have return backwards mixed with Spanish again. You get tente en el aire. Hold yourself up in midair. We don't know what you are. It's your race is too complicated. We don't know what to do. Does it sound too familiar? Les cayó el saco? I don't know what to tell you. But anyway, so similar ideas are happening right here. This again, this beautiful, beautiful detailed landscape that really gives you not illusion, but this idea that he knows how to compose within the restrictions of the canon, right? Because you have the atmospheric perspective, this idea that the farther something is from you, the more hazy it's going to look. So that's why you use all these blues. And the closer something is to you, like the fruit in the foreground of the composition, in the bottom right of the composition, it's going to be with more detail. But even with all of this, you still have the focus that is placed on the torna atrás. Again, and the torna atrás is defined by his clothing, the little baby, but the little kid by his clothing, but also he's defined by the color of his skin. Again, there's so many layers to your race in especially when you have African blood and when you have indigenous blood. Peoples of African descendancy, it was a lot more straightforward. You have a lot less rights. We know that, for example, people of African descendants and black skin were always compared to Jews, whereas in the idea that no matter who they mixed with or what they did, they could always conserve the quote-unquote negritude. And this is from an essay, again, by Maria Elena Martinez, Black Blood in New Spain. So to be sure, Spanish political ideology also allowed for the recognition of blacks as both vassals and Christians. After all, one of the main initial justifications for slavery, which Castilian laws classified as an unnatural human condition, was to bring infidels into the old Christian fold. It was believed that they had the curse of Ham, meaning that it's something that came from the book of Genesis, that there was a mark that they were the descendants of Ham, and the descendants of Ham, they had to be slaves. However, there is no biblical evidence that Ham was the father of African peoples. That was something invented in Europe. And the comparison with Judaism, it's tied to this idea of the loyalty of the crown, that by nature the people of Africa, they belong to other religions. They pray to other gods. So at any time they can come back to that. So the presence of Africans in these paintings has two purposes. The first one is to show that they have been quote unquote civilized, kind of like the barbarians that we're going to see. But at the same time is to show you that there's an anxiety towards that. So we're going to see two types of painting. The types of paintings that show black peoples, like you see right here, that they are part of society. Again, think of the clothing, think of the settings, because the settings are very important. But at the same time, we're going to see a series of paintings where you have the opposite, where they are going back to the old ways and they become violent peoples. The stereotypes that have horrible consequences in history. And that's what you see right here in Juan Patricio de Morlete Ruiz. We actually have a black person that has been civilized, sitting down, and you have a different approach to the idea of blackness in this composition. Here you have Juan Rodriguez Juarez, and again, this shows you the fact that also peoples of African descendancy could attain affluent puestos in the government. They could actually be people not in the main hegemonic institutions per se, but they could attain certain privileges. So it wasn't, once again, so black and white. Africans were not considered to be part of the viceroyalty. Instead, they were considered to be part of Spain and were administered as such. They were still part of the economy, and that is reflected in some of these compositions. Blacks in servitude in Spain has a long history that dates back to the Muslim period, where many northern African black slaves were under the service of Muslims. While black Africans were indeed also vessels of the crown, their involvement as quasi citizen was within the idea that since they were Muslims, servitude to Christian was to convert them eventually. And what is interesting also is that when peoples of Africa came as slaves into the Americas, just like the missionaries were in charge of the conversion of natives, so were the owners of the slaves in the Americas. And the history of slavery in New Spain, it's very different to that of the United States, and it's very complicated. But we do get that sense that if you are owner of a slave, it's your duty to convert your slaves. Is your duty to convert the peoples that you actually bought for your service. Many came from West Africa via Portugal, and many actually were baptized before arriving to the Americas. But still, you get this anxiety that they were to convert. Here you have this painting of Juan Rodriguez Juarez. Look at the clothing once again. So it is a more humble background, especially when it comes to the native, but when it comes to the person from African descendancy, it's a lot more complicated. I don't know exactly what his job would have been. I'm sure there's more information, but it gives you that sensation that his caste was a little bit more, had more privileges than others. And here you have Jose de Ibarra. And notice how Jose de Ibarra, for example, in his compositions, he doesn't just give you this frontal perspective of the peoples. Instead, you see them walking around in different angles. That is again to augment this idea that it's about the clothing. So you have to see different angles of the actual clothing to get a sensation, to get this, the idea that you can understand, or that you can understand who they were, or their casta, or the privileges of their casta based on their clothing. So it is important to picture them in different angles. In a sense, black were by definition impure because of their connections, real or imagined, to slavery, which by the early of the 17th century, various Spanish colonial institutions treated as a permanent stain on lineage, and which sought to deny the slave all sorts of rights and claims based on birth. Again, this is from Maria Elena Martinez. Many African descendants were acculturated, live in the same neighborhood as non-Christian, as other Spanish. They were creolized, but an anxiety of their invented violence and non-Christian background persisted throughout the colonial period. And with that in mind, we have these types of composition, for instance, like Jose de Alcivar and other painters that are giving you like the other side of this approach to blackness in New Spain. That first you have these compositions like Jose de Ibarra that give you the sensation that they are part of the economy of the city. They're walking around the city, the elaborate clothing from both the natives, the black, and the offspring. But then you have the other perspective that there was always an anxiety. There always an anxiety towards them, and to many they symbolize nothing but capital, meaning that owning a slave was a form of social status, even when at times they were not put to work as hard as one may think. So there were different levels of slavery in the Americas. Again, it's much more complicated. It wasn't so transparent as you may think. And again, all this information comes from Maria Elena Martinez, The Black Blood of New Spain. Wonderful article, and her book too. Also, it's important to read. And here you have one of the Also, another important series of Casta paintings. We have the paintings by Miguel Cabrera, and if we have time, when we talk more in detail about Miguel Cabrera, I'll show you more of his paintings from this series. But this one are from Jose de Alcivar, and Jose de Alcivar creates this wonderful compositions. Again, the inverted triangle that gives you all of the information, but you get a better sensation of this domestic, and almost, I can almost say that by now, they're very Mexican interiors. You have, for instance, the like you have the Spanish father, the black mother, and then you have the offspring that is a mulatto. And again, there are examples in art history of mulatto artists that actually were very successful, but it depended on the fathers. It depended on the type of lineage they came from. But you see that they are involved in tobacco, something related to tobacco. So you almost get the sensation that the father might have owned some land. He is dressed, for instance, in a banyan, and that was a typical male clothing that came from China. It's made out of chintz, which was a type of fabric produced in India, known as Indianilla in Mexico. He wears a Mexican pañuelo, and she wears a Mexican rebozo, and also the skirts, this almost like indigenous skirts that I told you before. And guess what she's making right there in the pot? She's making chocolate. Again, chocolate comes from the Americas. So everything about this composition screams quote to the Spanish, screams quote unquote New World. Again, I hate that phrase. Do not use it on your papers. There's nothing new about the Americas. But for somebody from Spain looking at this, it would have been a new world, because it's having a man dressed with textiles that came from Asia, with a fashion that it's local, with products that are Caribbean, with consumption of things like chocolate, that it's Mexican, that it's American, and even los trastes, even the things that you hear right here on the top, it could have been Talavera from Puebla. So like all of this is a composition that in a way illustrates the land of plentiful, like I showed you before with the landscape, but through an interiors, because the interior is always a reflection of the exterior, and back and forth. So that's important to keep in mind. And again, to come back to these compositions, there's always those images, which to be honest, I've never seen this one before by Jose de Alcivar, and I'm surprised that nobody has, or I have found a person that has written about this composition. But it's the same approach. You have this domestic interior, where you have a person of African descendancy that is reverted to the old and barbarian ways. So they're always involved in violence, and that's the anxiety that to a certain degrees for a lot of people throughout Latin America, it still exists today, and it's born right here. It is born out of this imagined ties with slavery, with resistance, with different religions, sort of like the anti-Spanish colony sentiments that you're supposed to obey. And look at the background. You actually have Talavera. You actually have these very American objects that are part of the composition. So this is what I was mentioning, that you have different aspects. You have the idea of appeasing anxieties and enhancing or like pushing for more stereotypes, more anxieties. And here you have one more. This is from an unknown artist, and we know that slavery is a system of absolute control. Control thus had its limits, for it created a culture of terror that not only victimized people of African descendancy, but also had deep psychological consequences on white people as well. That is not to say that the latter were victims too, but that they were imprisoned in a mental world that helped them to produce and reproduce violent behavior. And it's, again, these are sort of like stereotypes that are very violent, and they're not only affecting people of this period, they have consequences for many, 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 many years to come. Looking in these compositions, the chocolate that we saw being made in this one, it's spilling off. The little girl is like, no, mommy, please. Like, it's almost ridiculous the way that it is approached. And here it is the white Spanish. It is the it is the man that becomes the victim of this of the violence of blackness, for instance. Which again, a lot of these things, most of these things, or for the most part, these are things that they were created to, I don't want to say enhance because that's the wrong word, but they were created out of stereotypes and anxieties that were alive throughout the colonies, but also in Spain. And then you have this composition again. There's a general belief that people of albino peoples or gente albina, for instance, their blood came from African descendancy, but it wasn't. There's also other people that didn't understand that. So here you have a painting of the combination of Spanish with albino, and the result is a black kid. Is a jump backwards. So literally through the skin color, he's jumping back a casta. And these are the type of anxieties that were not necessarily all clear. So the fact that you have somebody, like two people of the same color of the skin that produces a different color skin. You know what this reminds me of? That's right. It reminds me of soap operas. When you think of the way that gendered, the race, the class functions in these paintings, I think of soap operas, especially of the 1980s, because in these soap operas, especially of that period, you have this whole thing where the father is very rich and he is from a Spanish background, and he falls in love with the maid. The maid is from an indigenous background. They have a kid, and then when the other wife finds out, then they have to be kicked out of the house while she's pregnant. And then one lucky day, the kid of this indigenous woman and this white man happens to be cleaning cars on the streets, and then the father sees him, and somehow his blood calls him, and he realizes that that's his son, and wara wara la cuchara. These ridiculous plots that continue to this day. But the anxieties of the mixing of race, the anxieties of mixing of classes, because again, class and race cannot be separated, start with these stories that you see right here from the colonial period, but they had its most violent consequences in the way that we approach race and gender and class and the combination of all of that through this bullshit right here. The title says telenovelas are from hell because there is a YouTube channel that it's amazing, and it's their videos about how ridiculous some of the stories are. So I am going to push you, and I wanted to do this here, but we don't have time. But there's a video on a soap opera called Marimar. Please do yourself a favor and watch it, and you can see Marimar right here with Talia, which is also a great star to follow on Instagram because the videos that she posts are bananas, and I'm just gonna leave it at that. But if you go to Telenovelas Are From Hell and watch the episode of Marimar, it is almost as the 5 or 6 minute video. It almost synthesizes everything that I have been talking about the Casta system, but through that soap opera. But what they denied is this character. This is called La Negra Corazón, or the black heart in a way. I mean, it doesn't have a right translation, but this is a character that comes from Caribbean fantasies of servitude. and it was very popular in Mexico. I yet to see or more people getting into the trope of the mammy in Latin America, because nobody talks about it. There is very visible in Marimar, but somehow the YouTube channel that I think is a great YouTube channel, Telenovelas Are From Hell, they denied this aspect of the telenovela. So when you go back to look at that video of the telenovelas are from hell, Marimar, think about this character, look at that video, and come back and look at our discussions about casta paintings, and you realize that that the consequences of that system have some of its biggest impact when they come together in the form of cinema, in the form of soap operas, in the form of radio and television in the 20th and 21st century. Okay, so the next lecture, or the second part of this lecture, is going to talk is us, or I mean me, obviously, talking about a different casta. I call this the 17th casta, and the reason is because in painting we only have 16 castas, and the 17th casta, according to this painting of Ignacio Maria Barreda, and we mentioned this briefly, belongs to the people that are not part of society. So, for example, if you go all the way to the top left of the composition, you're going to see the white father, the indigenous mother, and the offspring that is mestizo. They are in an interior, again, because the interior of the home, it's a space that has been converted into place, that has been transformed into place by the empire. Our ideas of race, class, and gender get solidified inside of the home. That's true for today, and that's true for back in the day. So, look, having, for example, the family unit in complete control inside of a home represented the empire. So that's exactly what you see on this frame on the top left of the composition. Also clothing. But if you notice, the farther away, and follow my cursor, the farther away you go from that formula, we see that the clothing starts to change. People are starting to wear less clothing. You can see people on the outside. We go from a fancy home to just huts. And again, all of them, yes, we have to think about castas because they're representing lower castas, but also different degrees or lower degrees of civilization. So a fully civilized family, it's the perfect family unit inside the home with fancy clothing. And the farther away you get from those tropes, you see the lack of more European technology in the construction of the home. Instead, you have a hut, and then you have the clothing that it's not as fancy anymore. You have a closer approach to nakedness. You start to see different things that are not part of this ideal frame, especially the frames that you see right here on the four top frames that you see on the top. And then you have 4x4, you have a total of 16 different castas. And then we have an extra one that is not even part of this group. This is just all the way to the bottom. They don't belong to the casta system. They are, and I hate to use this word, the other, but that's exactly what's happening right here. They're completely being othering from this racial order. And instead, and I have a close up, it's a little blurry, but they are just wandering around. They're not part of the city. They're not part of the economy of the city. They're instead are nomads as opposed to sedentaries. This is the typical clothing that we see in the portrayal of the barbarians from those maps, the first maps where you see America appearing from the late 15th and early 16th century. You actually see a lot of offsprings. They're reproducing and reproducing. This is part of the anxiety. This, for example, are the type of natives that didn't have those special privileges that I told you before. These are the type of natives that were considered barbarians. These are the type of natives that never that always resisted civilization. And by resisting civilization, I mean understanding Christ, understanding or being or becoming Christianized. So it's very interesting because this type of stereotype of the indigenous wandering around, the indigenous without clothing, the indigenous without dwelling, this type of anxiety for that barbarian has been around by this time. This is 1777, has been around for hundreds of years. And the trope doesn't change. The iconography doesn't change. The use of feathers, the use of the bow and arrow, it's the same. It was around in 1490s and it's still around in 1777. And if you watch some movies of the past 10 years, especially when it comes to the treatment of the Yanomamo in Brazil, you still have this anxiety of peoples without civilization, of the cannibals, of the barbarians. Here you have what has been described to me the quintessential Mexican painting, because this is a painting that has all the elements of the construction of Mexican iconography or Novo Hispanic coming into Mexican iconography. And again, when I say Mexican, and I'm talking about the colonial period, I'm referencing the Valley of Mexico. When I say Mexican after the independence, I'm referencing the nation. So that's why I always make those distinctions: Mexican, Novo Hispanic, New Spanish, etc., etc. Here you have the most important religious icon of New Spain, which is La Virgen de Guadalupe, right in the middle, looking down and blessing all of this casta system. On the right, you have people strolling around. This is supposed to be El Paseo de Jamaica. And on the left, you have the illustration of different dances. You also have a view of the newest sanctuary for the Virgen de Guadalupe. I don't think it's that old. You have the bird's eye perspective. Again, this is all about empire. This is all about what happens in the Americas for people to see it in other parts of the world. On the bottom of the composition, land of resources, as I mentioned before. So speaking about creating new types of compositions, new approach to casta composition. This is perhaps the most original out of all the compositions. You see aguacates and you see all kinds of different fruits and even some flowers that are part of the Americas. Again, because many times the peoples that are portrayed in these images, they are the flora and the fauna. They're just occupying space. If you're taking my classes, you know what I mean. Maybe in the future I'll work in a whole video about space and time. Shout out to Sharon Holland. Anyway, so you have people just occupying space in the background, serving the purposes of illustrating what the empire is all about. And what the empire is all about, it's civilizing. So if you notice on the top left composition, we have a reverse formula of what we've seen over and over again. We don't have the typical view of the Spanish man with the indigenous woman creating a mestizo. Instead, you have a view of a Spanish woman with a Barbaro Indian, the 17th Casta, that produces a type of mestizo. And this is unique. You don't see that at all. You don't see that in other compositions. Maybe there are others that I'm not familiar with, but it wasn't common. So there's been people, I think it was Hallie Shore who writes about this, but the idea is that here the Spanish woman, it's a representation of the Americas. It's a representation almost like of Spain, and the duty is to civilize the barbarian. So just like we talked about how the owner of a slave's duty was to civilize, quote unquote, civilize or convert the people, the person, the slave. The same thing with this composition. It is the duty of the Americas. And again, America has always been portrayed as a female character. It is a duty of America to civilize its uncivilized, to civilize its barbarian, to civilize its naked. And look at the way that he's portrayed. Again, I think you see just a couple of feathers, you see the bow and the arrow, all the basic signifiers of the uncivilized, of the barbarian, are shown right here. And that's exactly what this painting is about. It's about empire. It's about some of the elements that are going to render this untamed land, this colonies, from not just resources, not just showing resources, but how taming all of that is going to have its consequences on good economy. So that's what you see right here. So in a way, the layering of having the Virgen de Guadalupe on the top, the civilization on the hands of the domestic. Think about how the domestic, again, it's a representation of the empire, and the final result, it's like all of this plentifulness. That's what the empire is about. That's why this composition, it's very original. It's also extremely violent, but it's also super, super interesting because in a way you can explain a lot of the big themes of the 18th century that we've discussed in class. The Virgen de Guadalupe, this views of the city, the casta system, landscape painting. You can explain all of that with this composition. So it is a favorite of a lot of students for that specific reason. So in just like in the other painting, you have people like Jose de Vara, who is looking at, quote unquote, some of the other indigenous groups that are not part of these privileged positions of the first four castas in the system. Here you have the Otomi Indians that are shown part of the economy. But they're still not part of the city. They're walking around in el campo. They're walking around outside of the city. They almost seem to have no dwelling whatsoever. The clothing is raggedy, for instance, but still they are part of the empire. Still, they are in this Renaissance-like triangular composition, and we understand it right away. Here you have a painting by Ignacio de Castro, and they are, again, here you have indigenous people and mulatto people that are part of the everyday life of Mexico. So think about it. That's why I started last class with these big images of Mexico City and El Parian, because what we started to do is just getting closer and closer and closer and take a look of some of those frames, some of the everyday scenes. And it's what happens right here. So we have to think about it like that, because in many respects, that's how they would have been seen, these images. They were, for the most part, transferred or shipped to Spain, and people would have understood them like that. The everyday life, and the everyday life, the flora and fauna of the everyday life, the face of the empire on the other side of the Atlantic. Here I have one more of Ignacio de Castro, of Tente en el Aire, y Mulata creates an albarrazado. Again, one of those crazy names that in a way tells you how complicated and how ridiculous the casta system was, but also how the real consequences that it had for people of the 17th and 18th century and still today. And then here you have also Juan Rodriguez Juarez, which it's the same approach to the Chichimecas. Again, to me is fascinating these paintings for several reasons. One, because the iconography hasn't changed. You have the idea of the nakedness. There's almost an approach, like a sensuous approach to the body, which reads in terms of the heathen. That that heathen body, the approach to the human anatomy, that it's more contingent to the way that the Christians were looking at Greek sculptures, for instance. When the early Christian period, the approach to human anatomy wasn't as romanticized, wasn't as realistic, because a naked human form was a representation of the heathen and the fallen of the fall of man. And that's exactly what happens right here. So, regardless of the clothing of the nomad groups throughout the Americas, they were always portrayed this way, with a couple of feathers, with the bow, the arrow. And look at the kid. The kid is a baby. He probably doesn't even know how to walk yet, and he already knows how to use the bow and the arrow. So, again, and all of that reads uncivilized, and all of that reads anxiety. And I talk about anxiety specifically because in the beginning, in the 16th century, you have this European anxiety towards this unknown lands of the New World. And then as people started to create their idea of what the Americas was, you started with I don't know, the exportation or the importation of some of the objects that were created in places like Peru. The Europeans got to see some of the gold from Peru, some feather objects from 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 the Aztec world, and different types of material culture like that render the uncivilized in a different way. So as you have that, we have that the anxieties towards the unknown natives, the unknown or uncivilized natives or Indios, started to shift. In Mexico, for instance, it was all about the Chichimeca. And here I have a map from 1550 of the different groups that were to a certain point considered the Chichimeca. So you have the Huachichiles, the Zacatecos, the Tepecanos, the Cascanes o Cascanes, the Pames, Otomís, Guamares, the Queshes. And a lot of those groups, some did have sedentary places, and some of them, they were nomads. And they have been like that for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So as the empire in the 16th century starts to expand towards the north, they are confronted with band of all of these different groups. So they were basically all crammed into this single category, which is the Chichimeca. And the term Chichimeca, we already talked about it in class, but I wanted to bring it back again. The origin, and this is from Charlotte M. Grady, Discovering the Chichimecas. The origin of the word Chichimeca is part of the long history of the evolution of Nahuatl. The term was used by Nahuatl-speaking inhabitants of the Central Valley of Mexico to designate the peoples who lived north and west of the Valley of Mexico, and has been variously translated to mean sons of dogs, rope suckers, or eagles. With the letters of Hernán Cortés, Chichimeca passed into the Spanish language. For the Spanish, the Chichimeca were wild, nomadic people who lived north of the Valley of Mexico. They had no fixed dwelling places, lived by hunting, wore no clothes, and fiercely resisted foreign intrusion into their territory, which happened to contain silver mines the Spanish wished to exploit. Once again, this description of the Chichimeca fits this illustration of Ignacio Maria Barreda. They are the 17th. They are the 17th Casta. They se quedan afuera of the whole entire of this racial order. And what is fascinating, which I think I mentioned, is that you have the Franciscans, the Dominicans start to place their missions along the edges of the Chichimeca land. So in a way, one, to claim territory for Spain, also in a strategic places so they can spiritually conquer that 17th Casta, that in a way that anxiety towards them doesn't go away, because native peoples are always resisting. For example, we know that in places like Guanajuato, for instance, there were some nomad tribes that have been sustaining themselves for hundreds of years. And with the Spanish came a shift into the production of food, and the climate starts to change. So everything started to change by those groups. So they had to start attacking. They had to start resisting in order to survive, because their ecosystem and their the survival tactics that depended on trading with other nomad tribes and groups, all of a sudden change. And by the time the Spanish came and they started attacking, so they can displace them, so they can enter important mining centers such as places like Zacatecas, which will become one of the most important mining cities in New Spain. Because of that, there's an increasing resistance towards Spanish control. So the anxiety towards the Chichimeca doesn't go away. What we're going to see later on is that the anxiety of the Chichimeca, again, we were talking about here central of Mexico, is going to migrate to the north. So we have this long history, and I talk about this in my book project. But the way that the administration deals with the Chichimeca, with its 17th Casta, the way that they are portrayed in these images of the 18th century, it's very similar to the way they're going that the administration and the Franciscans and other Mendicant orders are going to understand not the Chichimeca in the 18th century, of the 16th century, but the Native Americans of what today is the Southwest of the United States. So let me explain a little bit more. So in a way, there was an idea that a lot of, by the 17th century, everybody had been converted, and like we can discuss that for a long time because it's true, but it's not true. And there's a lot of examples that show that that was the case, but there's a lot of examples that shows that that's not the case. But a general idea existed that a lot of people had been converted. However, as I mentioned before, these groups, especially nomad groups, especially groups towards the north or in places or in the deep south, like places like Chile with the Mapuche, they never stop resisting. And they signify a lot of problems for the Spanish administrations. So while Central Mexico was a reflection of the golden era of the mission system of peoples of like the Franciscans, for instance, the North never necessarily reflected that. But still, it was just like un par de indios revoltosos. You had a couple of revolts here and there. It didn't mean much for the Spanish, even though the anxiety was always there. And then on 1680, you're going to have the Pueblos of New Mexico that are going to come together. They had enough. They spent such a long time trying to survive under the Spanish administrations, under the abuses of the Franciscans, and they finally had enough. In 1680, they all came together and revolted, and what they created was a revolution. Even though people referred to that as the Pueblo Revolt, I refer to it as the Pueblo Revolution. So the revolution of 1680 happens, and all of a sudden, everybody starts to rethink how they're going to approach the mission system, how they're going to approach the nomad peoples of the North, and how they are going to be portrayed. So this almost standardized way of portraying that 17th Casta in a way disappears in the 17th century. You don't have a lot of examples of that. Then you have the Pueblo Revolution, and then you have the Bourbons coming into power in the 1700s, and those stereotypes and those anxieties come back. That's when you start to see casta paintings, and that's when you start to see a lot of images of martyrs. But this is a whole entire discussion. So I wanted to end with this map, and this map that you see right here shows you the different pueblos of Mexico. And I think I mentioned this before, but they were considered pueblos because these are groups of people amongst a land that was filled with the Apache, the Comanche, and the Apache, the Comanche are always resistant, right? And they're not necessarily just in fixed dwellings, in actual cities or pueblos or towns. So for the Spanish to name the peoples of New Mexico pueblos, it was almost like a sign of respect. Oh, they are more civilized than the Comanche, especially right now, because right now around New Mexico, again, you have the Navajo, the Comanche, you have other groups that are around this area. But if you notice, the United States is starting to push west, but also you have disputed territories with the English, with the French. And the French, for instance, by the 18th century, by the middle to late 18th century, they actually start negotiating with the Comanche. So the anxiety, the Chichimeca like anxiety, the 17th Casta like anxiety of the 16th century becomes a new type of anxiety after the Pueblo Revolution and with the advent of all of these different territories of different European powers coming into contact with the West. So it's super complicated, but it's important to know because all of that has its consequences on these types of composition that we see right here. So the Chichimeca, even though it looks like a Chichimeca in the 16th century and the 17th century, in the popular imaginary, well, the Chichimeca was situated right here. In the 18th century, it's situated in what today is the Southwest. So put a pin on that. Así se dice? I don't know. So just, yeah, put a pin on that and think about the new Chichimeca of the 18th century, the Pueblo Revolution, and then I'm gonna show you some paintings that I wrote my dissertation about and that I'm working for this book project. Again, be careful, cover your mouth, take care of your elders. Do not go outside if you don't have to. It is complicated. Last week, somehow, it seemed like a particularly hard week, but it seems like we're going to make it and it's going to be good. And it's going to be also hard when we go outside again. So, again, leave your comments. Make sure to subscribe. And if you actually are enjoying the classes, tell people so they can also subscribe. And so you can have this dialogue with other people, because I've had so many students throughout the years talking about how they wish this cousin or this person will take this class. Well, now it's an opportunity and it's free, so everybody can be part of this dialogue. And you can send me an email with any questions. You can go to our boards on Blackboard and comment, and make sure to post your responses to the videos on the right place on Blackboard. So make sure to go to Blackboard, go to the assigned week. This is week 4, video 2 of week 4, and see where you have to post your video. Some of you I talked to about responding via email, but it's because of specific circumstances. So that doesn't apply to everybody. That's it. Have a wonderful rest of the week and weekend. Again, enjoy this time at home, and we will finish the discussion on castas next class. We'll get into European painting, and we'll talk about other things before we finish the semester. And again, hopefully I will continue to post some other classes that we didn't get to finish this semester on the YouTube channel. So keep checking. Okay, bye-bye.